It's a real pleasure to be with you and your colleagues. Congratulations on your 136th annual general meeting. That's nothing to be scoffed at. So I think you all have done well. And so kudos to the Chamber of Commerce. I would like to, thank the previous presenters as well, Mr. Vincent Boland, who have been meeting almost every day now for the last couple of weeks in different meetings and different settings. So it's a pleasure to be responding to the audience after listening to his presentation. He covered a lot of interesting ground, which I won't aim to go over. And then I'm following on from Dr. Sharon Belma-George, the CMO, who has done an excellent job in her presentation, but also has done Saint Lucia proud in the way in which she has managed the pandemic and keeping the communication with all the various stakeholders going. So I know I'm coming in after Dr. Belma-George. It's a hard act to follow. And I know that I'm somewhere between you and your other activities. So I'm going to try and make this brief. So I've entitled my presentation, Adapting, Operating, and Thriving in the Next Normal, Critical Perspectives on the COVID-19 Context. Of course, the topic was chosen by the Chamber. I think it's a very apt topic, questioning really how do we adapt to the context of COVID-19. In my view, I've tried to stay away from using the word post-pandemic as much as to use the term coexisting with the pandemic or coexisting with COVID. Because, if you look at it, the world is still dealing with cholera, and the Caribbean had 3 waves of cholera in the 19th century. And many of the same issues that we are dealing with today, quarantining, isolating, social distancing, were all applied back then during the 19th century. And we still have cholera with us today. It's just that it's been managed. We've created the public health systems to contain the problem of cholera. And that's what we'll have to do with COVID and many of the other emerging diseases that are coming down the pipeline. So COVID is really a wake-up call, meaning that we need to get our systems in order to manage these processes. It's what in literature we are calling cascading fragilities in the global economy. And so we may as well start learning how to live in this context. So as Brian indicated, I've done a lot of work on Arthur Lewis's work. And in fact, one of my publications on Lewis refers specifically to his last book, which is entitled Growth and Fluctuations. And in that book, he explains what happens in the global economy during a period of crisis. A period of crisis is a period when you have slower growth, particularly in the developed economies, what Arthur Lewis refers to as the engine of growth. So in his Nobel Prize speech, he uses the term slowing down of the engine of growth as the premier issue that he's grappling with. And Arthur Lewis is one of the few economists who utilizes historical economic data to explain the shifts and turns, the cyclical changes in the global economy. And in that regard, he's able to present a range of tools for us to analyze these frameworks so that, for example, the global economic downturn that we've been experiencing since 2007 is not an anomaly. This is part of the way in which the global economy goes through a process of renewal and change. What we do note is that Lewis is in good company with people like Joseph Schumpeter. So Joseph Schumpeter, who is the author of terms like entrepreneur, innovation, and so on, also talks about a process of what he calls creative destruction. That when you have a global economic crisis or period of significant downturn that can last 2 decades, what you have is a reordering of the economy and society. And so that's what he means by this process of creative destruction. So the global economy has been going through a process of creative destruction for the last decade or more. One can almost say almost 2 decades now. And what we're seeing with COVID is that COVID is accelerating the process of transformation. And so if you go back and look at some of Lewis's work, he says when economies go through these processes of rapid slowing down of the global economy and the engine of growth is in transformation, developing countries like our own experience a number of things: declining terms of trade, reduced commodity exports. And in this case, I mean, when he was writing back then, he meant, you know, bananas and sugar and so on, but it also applies to things like tourism and so on. Balance of payments problems, external indebtedness, including debt crises, and an accumulation of social debt, meaning that many of the socioeconomic gains that would have been had during the upswing period tends to go into reversal. So for example, your investments in health and in education and social stability can be undermined by a global economic crisis. What Lewis also suggests that as a context is that there tends to be a surge of industrialization or a process of reindustrialization in countries that are affected by a global economic crisis, which we saw in the Caribbean during the World War I and World War II periods, or when was the global economic depression of the 1930s. And so you see a decline in imports and a growth in local production to supplement or to provide a replacement for imports. However, when things go back to normal, there tends to be a process of deindustrialization. And we go back to the norm, which is high import bills for energy, for food, for pharmaceuticals, et cetera, et cetera. And so in many respects, if you look at the Caribbean's experience over the last 200 years, we've gone through periods of crisis where there tends to be a surge of industrialization. And as soon as the global economy goes back to some level of stability, we go back to a process of being normal again and having increased or high levels of dependency on the global economy for our essentials. And so, in fact, if you look at the trajectory over time, the Caribbean has become even more susceptible to the winds and shifts of the global economy. And the COVID context is emblematic of that. And so what we're seeing in some of the data, and some of this data is actually even pre-COVID. So it really shows that economies like Saint Lucia, and I've highlighted Saint Lucia here in green and yellow to illustrate both foreign exchange reserves, import coverage, and the impact, estimated impact of COVID in terms of GDP impact. And you can see that, you know, Saint Lucia is somewhere in the middle of the pack relative to other small island developing states, most of which I've highlighted here from the Caribbean. So, you know, for example, in my country, Trinidad and Tobago, they have lots of foreign exchange reserves, you know, several months of import coverage in effect. And the estimated impact from COVID is fairly low relative to the rest of the region. That's because Trinidad and Tobago is a major exporter of hydrocarbons. And even though hydrocarbons has gone through a process of decline in prices, it's not a huge draw back on the economy to the same extent as you would see in the tourism-dependent economies like Saint Lucia, like St. Kitts and Grenada, and so forth. So the tourism-dependent economies are the ones that are being impacted the most by the scenario with COVID, because they're heavily reliant on travel. And so with travel restrictions and border closures and so forth, it means that their key markets and key destination markets are compromised. We're not out of the woods, as the CMO indicated, and we're all watching television and know that in Europe and North America, which are our key source markets, they're into a second and third wave with an accelerated rate of infection. And so returning to some normality is going to be some time before that happens. You can also look at because we are tourism-dependent economies, the key issue then is how do we manage both our tourism economy and manage our external indebtedness, because COVID is putting a huge burden on our countries and our governments to finance a whole range of things. All the socioeconomic fallout from COVID, whether it is providing resources for key sectors that have been impacted, or the workers that have been displaced, or providing a social safety net, making sure that every child gets a laptop at school. The burden on governments all around the world, and particularly in small island developing states that are heavily dependent on tourism, has gone through the roof. And so the emergent scenario for the next decade or more is a huge indebtedness among these countries. And so that is really the elephant in the room. So yes, we're dealing with a crisis as we view it now, but this crisis is going to be sustained for a very long time because of the indebtedness issue. So, and I've been discussing this with other countries all around the Caribbean and further afield. In fact, I was on a meeting this morning with the OECD, where I was working up till late last year. I was running their unit on structural policies and innovation. And this is some of the discussions we have with countries. So basically, Saint Lucia, like most other developing countries, have three options. Option one is status quo, which is we continue with very weak economic diversification, mostly reactive and emergency policy responses, and trying to manage our ecological and social challenges. That tends to be our default position. The challenge with that, though, is that you may well end up with option number two, which is reversal, which is if you continue with an economic monoculture like Saint Lucia has, which is it's overly dependent on the tourism sector, or like my country, Trinidad and Tobago, if you're overly dependent on oil and gas, that economic monoculture leads to and results in what I call passive denialism, which is that we know that we need to change, but we never get the machinery in place to make that change. It's, so we've been talking about economic diversification in the Caribbean since the days of the Moyne Commission, which was back in the early 20th century. And we haven't yet made any significant shifts in our economic structures. We've replaced one level of dependency with another level of dependency. So Saint Lucia's moved from a high level of dependency on bananas to a high level of dependency on tourism. And so you run the risk of moving from status quo to reversal very quickly because of instabilities in the global economy or the weaknesses in your capacity at home. So the preferred option would be reinvention, where you diversify through innovation, where you engage in strategic transformation, and where you generate what we call social and environmental renewal. So how do we do this? How do we get there? Well, I think at a minimum, Saint Lucia and most Caribbean and most developing countries need to do these four things, especially those that are tourism dependent economies. So we need to do tourism diversification, of course. I'm putting that as my number one because it's a tourism dependent economy. It's both to do diversification outside of tourism, but also diversification within tourism. So within terms of diversification within tourism, things like educational tourism, I think, is an area where Saint Lucia is somewhat behind some of its neighbors. And this is an area I think we need to give greater emphasis to. I think Grenada is probably the best example in the region, with St. George's University contributing in excess of 20% of the GDP of Grenada, or in the case of, let's say, Barbados, Ross University is estimated to account for close to 3% of the GDP. So educational tourism is a really important area for growth and diversification. Then there's medical tourism, business relocation, and other business-related type tourism, cultural and heritage tourism, festival tourism, et cetera, et cetera. And so doing this kind of internal or diversification within tourism is an important area for activity and strategic engagement. The next area I would like to talk about is really health and food resilience. The Caribbean has the unenviable position of having one of the highest rates of chronic non-communicable diseases profile. We have very unhealthy populations. Our populations are far too sedentary, and they're eating too high caloric foods, too much sugar, too much salt. We have a public health emergency that has been hitting the region for a decade or more. We have increasing levels of child obesity, et cetera, et cetera. So COVID has really highlighted how important it is for us to enter into a preventative health framework. Not only is this a health issue, it is also an economic issue, because if you look at the data from PAHO on the productivity losses from chronic non-communicable diseases in the region, we are among the highest in the world. Absenteeism from the work, low productivity, you just name it. And so preventative health is both an health issue and it's an economic issue. It's also a competitiveness issue, which is that it provides a new opportunity for us to create new jobs and not just focusing on curative medicine. Linked to that, of course, is dealing with our food import replacement strategy. I know the government has a 7-crop strategy already in place to deal with particularly the tourism sector, but we need to embellish this with an agri-tech and agri-entrepreneurship framework that really creates new employment, but also new businesses in the area of agriculture. The next area I wanted to touch on is the digital and creative economy. This one is dear to my heart. I've been key researcher in this area for a long time. But as you could see with COVID, yes, the creative industries has been impacted negatively because people can't travel. So festival tourists can't come to the region, or artists can't travel out. But what it means though is that we need to develop a stronger ICT and telecoms capability linked to digital trade, e-commerce, and so forth, and strengthening that capacity. So this has to do everything with the creative economy, and the creative economy is really critical for most countries. It's the means by which you are able to brand your destination. So it links back to your tourism sector. It's also the mechanism by which you are able to do what we call intellectual property branding for your goods and services, and so which can help with the export diversification process. But of course, you have to have good cyber tech, good cyber security to participate in all of this. And in most Caribbean countries, we have been severely underinvesting in developing the capacity in these areas. And the world economy has shifted or pivoted in this direction very rapidly with COVID, and we need to do big catch up. The last area I want to talk about is labor, low carbon competitiveness, which can be linked to everything from the circular economy, renewable energy, green economy, blue economy. Mr. Boland spoke about the green economy financing mechanism that they put in place. And so I really want to applaud the initiatives there. But all of these things are interlinked. So for example, most Caribbean countries, and Saint Lucia is no exception, we are very energy inefficient economies and societies. We have too much traffic on the road. We don't have enough public transport. We are basically squandering a lot of our energy, and most of that is imported. So our import bill for energy is one of the key dependencies that are affecting us. And as island, but also ocean states, we need to be taking advantage of the blue economy to a greater degree. And it's now, one of the biggest growth areas for discussion in the development field. How can we explore the opportunities in the blue economy? But I won't dwell too much on these things. So what I want to do is just say, well, what role for this St. Louis Community College in all of this? As the premier tertiary institution in Saint Lucia, and I would dare say in the OECS region, I would say, and I've been only on the job for 1 year, this month is 1 year, we have a lot of work to do. On Monday, I spoke at the People's Parliament, which was organized by UNDP and Jeff and so on. It was excellent. In my presentation, I referred to some data which compares Saint Lucia to the other OECS territories and the wider Latin America and the Caribbean. And in that presentation, I showed that Saint Lucia's expenditure on tertiary education is 5% of the total expenditure on education. The average for the OECS is 8%. So Saint Lucia is one of the lowest countries in terms of investment in tertiary education relative to the OECS. The average for Latin America and the Caribbean is 20%. And so Saint Lucia is operating at 1/4 of what the average is for Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of investment in tertiary education. And also, if you look, and I've been looking at the data for the last several months, of course, what the government of Saint Lucia is spending on tertiary education in Saint Lucia, at the college today, is less than it did when the college was first established. So there's been a process of chronic underinvestment in tertiary education. Yet the expectations are very high. Where do we, make a judgment in terms of the way forward? It's also that the fee structures for the associate degrees and even particularly the associate degree programs that we offer at the college is one of the lowest in the region. I think it's only Grenada where it's cheaper, and possibly Antigua. So we have low fees, low subventions, but high expectations. And really, the demands for an economy to do the process of reinvention, which I spoke about earlier, requires that you have an academic institution that does a number of things for the society in terms of not just training, but doing research and critical research in key growth areas, so that our firms, our enterprises, and our workers are closer to the cutting edge than so that you are not far behind the global economy. One of my favorite authors is Carlota Perez. She's originally from Venezuela. She works at Cambridge University now. And she says that development is a moving target. And what she's suggesting is that you need to be in a position to ride the wave when it's rising rather than when it's cresting. So in that regard, what we have been doing at the college in the last several months is this. Outside of our mainstay, which is our associate degree programs and our BA programs, we are creating some new areas for engagement with the Saint Lucia economy and society, as well as beyond Saint Lucia. So in the last several weeks, we have actually set up an e-learning academy. And in this regard, and even with the meager resources that we have, our e-learning academy is now the #1 e-learning academy in the OECS. And so we've been providing services to other territories outside of Saint Lucia. This is something that we are hoping to ramp up, if not double and triple, because we see digital education as a growth sector and an export sector for the college and for Saint Lucia. The other thing that we are working on, which is moving along very rapidly, we have good support from the Saint Lucia Development Bank. Invest Saint Lucia is also on board. We're also getting support from the AICA, which is the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation and Agriculture. They've come to us to establish an innovation lab, and that's moving along very quickly, so we're quite pleased about that. But we're also getting support from other key players. So for example, one of the Saint Lucian diaspora is someone who works at Arizona State University. She's a graduate from the college. She's one of our alumni. And they have agreed, in fact, to help us set up the innovation lab. So we provide them with a list of the equipment and the space that we'll be using. And they have offered to design the space for us for free. But they're already beginning to collaborate with us and our students in a number of areas. So that is coming along very quickly, and we'll be able to share that information with you. We're also working on establishing a digital and creative academy. We are working with our cultural ambassador from Saint Lucia, Gordon Williams, to set up a sound and audio engineering facility. But we're also setting up an animation and new media facility, along with doing training in fintech and cyber tech areas, as well as digital entrepreneurship. Next is the Upskilling Academy, which is a request that has come from the private sector only in the last week or two. So we are framing a proposition to do what we're calling micro-credentialing or nano degrees. So I'll be able to share with you in the next week what we're proposing to do. And it really dovetails with some of the sectors that I've identified: green economy, blue economy, digital economy, and public health areas, along with business analytics and analysis. Then there's a diplomatic academy. We are in discussion with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to run a series of workshops targeted not only at diplomats and foreign service professionals, but also anyone who's engaged in external representation, in commercial diplomacy and so forth. So chamber members will be sending to you a flyer, which we are hoping to get up and off the charts, off the blocks in the next week or two. And the last area is what we're calling gateways to global careers. We have, working with Arizona State University and several other universities, we are creating a pipeline so that our students who are doing our associate degree programs can engage in a process of learning outside of the walls of the school, outside of the traditional curriculum. So we are putting students to work in groups to do through an incubator process, where at the end of the pipeline, they participate in a design competition. The winners of the design competition will get prizes or access to various opportunities. We're working with Invest Saint Lucia on this, and we're also working with a US portal called Startup Space, which Invest Saint Lucia has facilitated. So our students will be able to put up their projects online, get feedback from entrepreneurs around the world, particularly in the United States, and potentially even access funding. So I wanted to end on that note to say that we are reframing the value proposition at the college to, I think, respond to the increasing demands for diversification of the solution economy, of the OECS economies, as well as the wider Caribbean economies. I think the promise is good for the college to move out of its traditional bubble into this expanded area of opportunities. What we need as strategic partners to move to the next level. And so these are the discussions we've been having with the chamber and other key players. And so we invite your participation as we proceed. So thanks very much again, Brian, for this invitation. I was looking at my emails this morning and I noted that you had originally invited me to make this presentation back in March or April, and the world changed. So, but it's a real delight for me to being able to participate this morning. Thanks again. All the best, and over to you.